Texas, 1945. The mesquite trees cast long shadows across Camp Swift, where wooden barracks stood silent in the afternoon heat. Inside one, a woman sat with her arms crossed, jaw set, eyes fixed on nothing. Her name was Greta Hoffman. For 6 months, the guards had tried everything: kindness, patience, even chocolate. She answered in German or not at all. Then one November evening, a farm wife named Dorothy Miller walked through the gate carrying a ceramic dish covered with a checkered cloth. What happened next would dissolve 6 years of propaganda in a single bite. The Atlantic, March 1945. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of old steel. Below deck, in the converted cargo hold of the SS Marine Raven, 73 German women sat on wooden benches bolted to the floor. The ship rolled. Metal groaned. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was sick. Greta pressed her back against the bulkhead and closed her eyes. The air smelled of diesel fuel, salt, and fear. Around her, women whispered in the dark, mothers separated from children, nurses captured at field hospitals, office workers who'd typed the wrong documents. The youngest was 17, the oldest, 62. None had expected this. She had been told Americans were barbaric, that they would parade prisoners through streets while crowds threw stones, that the camps would be death traps, cold and brutal, where women would be worked until they collapsed. The propaganda films had shown it: American cruelty, American savagery, American hatred of the German people. But propaganda couldn't explain the blankets. 3 days into the crossing, a sailor had brought them down, wool blankets, thick and clean, one for each woman. He'd handed them out without speaking, his face neutral, then disappeared back up the ladder. The women had stared at the blankets for a long time before anyone touched them. Greta pulled hers tighter now and listened to the engine's rhythm. 17 days at sea. 17 days to imagine what waited on the other shore. The train ride west began at dawn in New York Harbor. March wind cut through the dock, and the women stepped onto American soil for the first time, their feet unsteady after weeks aboard ship. Guards in pressed uniforms guided them toward waiting railroad cars, not cattle cars as they'd expected, but passenger coaches with cushioned seats and windows that opened. Greta took a seat near the back and watched the city slide past. Buildings taller than anything in Berlin, cars everywhere, people walking freely, their coats unbombed, their faces fed. The contrast struck her silent. For 3 days, the train rolled southwest, through Pennsylvania's greening hills, across the Ohio River's muddy width, into the flatlands of Missouri where farms stretched to the horizon. At stops, American citizens gathered on platforms to watch the train pass. Some stared with curiosity, some with hatred. Most just looked tired, holding newspapers with headlines about Iwo Jima, about advancing armies, about American boys dying in Europe. The guards brought sandwiches, white bread, thick slices of ham, yellow cheese. Greta ate mechanically and said nothing. Beside her, a younger woman named Liesel tried speaking to a guard in broken English. He answered kindly, explaining they were headed to Texas, that the camp was on farmland, that there would be work, but also rest, medical care, fair treatment under Geneva Convention rules. Liesel translated for the others. Several women nodded, cautiously hopeful. Greta remained silent, her face a mask. She had learned not to trust words. Only actions revealed truth. By the 4th day, the landscape had transformed entirely. The trees grew shorter, more scattered. The earth turned red and then brown. The sky opened up until it seemed to swallow everything. Endless blue stretching in all directions, broken only by distant clouds that cast shadows like moving islands across the plains. This was Texas. Camp Swift sat 20 miles east of Austin, sprawling across 13,000 acres of scrubland and oak groves. When the transport truck rolled through the main gate on March 19, 1945, Greta saw rows of white barracks, guard towers spaced evenly along chain-link fencing, and beyond it all, the endless Texas sky pressing down like judgment. The women were processed in a building that smelled of pine disinfectant and new paint. Forms to sign. Fingerprints recorded. Medical examinations by a doctor who spoke German with a Bavarian accent. and told them in their own language that they would be treated fairly, that this was not a labor camp in the Nazi sense, that Geneva rules applied here. Greta signed the papers and said nothing. They were assigned to Barrack 7, a long wooden structure with 24 beds, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets. Windows along both walls let in afternoon light. At the far end, a stove stood cold and clean. The building was newer than any she'd lived in for the past 2 years. That first night, lying on the unfamiliar mattress, Greta listened to the sounds of the camp. Distant voices speaking English. A radio playing music somewhere. American jazz, bright and incomprehensible. The wind moving through mesquite trees. No sirens, no bombs. Just the strange, unsettling peace of being a prisoner in enemy territory. She decided then, she would not speak their language, not a word. It was the only power she had left, the power to remain separate, to resist in the one way they couldn't force. The days established their rhythm. Réveillé at 6. Breakfast in a mess hall that served portions larger than anything she'd seen in Germany since 1941. Oatmeal, eggs sometimes, bread with butter, coffee that was real and hot. Then work assignments. Most women were assigned to the base laundry, kitchen duty, or administrative offices. Greta was placed in the textile repair shop, mending uniforms and parachutes alongside 6 other German women and 2 American supervisors. The work was tedious, but not difficult. The supervisors, both women in their 50s, spoke to them slowly and clearly, demonstrating what needed to be done, then leaving them to it. Greta worked in silence. When the supervisors spoke to her directly, she looked up, nodded if she understood, and returned to her stitching. When they asked questions, she responded in German or not at all. The other women adapted differently. Liesel, young and resilient, began learning English immediately, picking up words and phrases, laughing at her own mistakes. An older woman named Frau Richter organized evening lessons in the barracks, teaching the younger ones proper English pronunciation from a textbook the camp chaplain had provided. Greta attended but did not participate. She sat in the back, listening, absorbing, but never speaking. The words felt like surrender in her mouth. The guards tried various approaches. First was patience, simply waiting for her to need something badly enough to ask for it in English. But Greta made do. She pointed, she gestured, she drew simple pictures. She enlisted Liesel as translator when absolutely necessary. Then came incentives. Extra dessert rations for those who participated in English conversation practice. Greta declined silently. Access to the camp library for those who could write a request in English. Greta borrowed books through Liesel's requests instead. One guard, a young corporal named Stevens with a kind face and wire-rimmed glasses, took particular interest in her case. He would sit near her during lunch breaks and talk about simple things: the weather, the food, his family's farm in Iowa. He didn't expect answers. He just talked as if normalcy itself might erode her resistance. Greta listened and said nothing. By June, 3 months into her internment, the staff psychologist requested a meeting. Dr. Helen Cartwright was a thin woman with sharp eyes and an unexpected gentleness. She spoke some German and conducted the session mostly in Greta's language, asking about her life before the war, her family, her work as a telegraph operator in Bremen. Greta answered the questions in German, described her childhood, her mother who died when she was 12, her work at the communications office, the night the bombs came and destroyed everything. When Dr. Cartwright asked why she refused English, Greta's voice went flat. "It is the language of my captors." "You are not a captive in the way you imagine," Dr. Cartwright replied in German. "You are protected here. The war will end, and you will go home." "Home to what?" Greta asked, and the silence that followed answered everything. Dorothy Miller was not supposed to be at Camp Swift that day. The 56-year-old farm wife had driven into Austin for supplies when her truck's radiator overheated near the camp's southern fence. A guard helped her add water and mentioned, in passing, that they had German POWs working in the textile shop who could repair the torn seat cover she'd been complaining about. Dorothy, whose son was fighting in France, whose husband had died at Pearl Harbor, whose entire world had been carved up by this war, found herself agreeing before she thought about it. She met Greta on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The air had finally cooled, and the light through the repair shop windows was the color of honey. Dorothy handed over the truck's bench cover, canvas torn along one seam, and the American supervisor gestured to Greta. Greta took the cover, examined the damage, nodded, held up 5 fingers. 5 days. Dorothy studied her, this German woman with tired eyes and careful hands, probably not much younger than herself, wearing a plain gray dress that had been mended multiple times. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Dorothy did something unexpected. In broken, heavily accented German, she said, "Thank you." Greta's hands stilled on the canvas. She looked up, surprised, then nodded once and returned to her inspection. Dorothy came back 3 days later, though the cover wasn't ready. She brought a mason jar of peach preserves from her last summer's canning and left it with the supervisor, pointing at Greta. For her, for the work. The supervisor raised an eyebrow, but accepted it. When Greta received the preserves that evening, she stood holding the jar for a long time, feeling its weight, seeing the amber light through glass, reading the handwritten label. Peaches, Aug. 1945, D. Miller. She opened it at dinner and shared it with the women in her barracks. They spread it on bread and ate in silence, tasting something that felt dangerously close to kindness. Dorothy returned the following week to collect the cover. It had been repaired so carefully that the seam was nearly invisible. She paid the camp office their fee, then asked if she could bring the worker a thank you gift. The administrator hesitated, then agreed, with supervision present. Dorothy came back 2 days later carrying a ceramic dish covered with a checkered cloth. The autumn sun was setting, casting everything in orange light. The supervisor led her into the mess hall, where Greta sat at a corner table, mending a shirt in the fading day. "This is for you," Dorothy said in English, setting the dish on the table. Greta looked at it but didn't move. Dorothy uncovered the dish. Inside was an apple pie, still slightly warm, its latticed crust golden and perfect, cinnamon fragrance rising into the air like a memory of something lost. "Apple pie," Dorothy said. Then, in her rough German, "Apfelkuchen." Greta stared at the pie. Her mother used to make Apfelkuchen in the autumn before the war, when there were still apples and butter and sugar, when the world made sense. The smell transported her violently backward, to a kitchen in Bremen, to her mother's hands dusted with flour, to a time before everything burned. Her eyes filled. She blinked hard, but the tears came anyway, carving lines down her face. Dorothy pulled out a chair and sat down. She cut 2 slices, placed one before Greta, kept one for herself. Lifted her fork. For a long moment, Greta didn't move. The other women in the mess hall had gone quiet, watching. The supervisor stood near the door, uncertain. Then Greta picked up her fork. The first bite was sweetness and spice, butter and fruit, crust that dissolved on her tongue. It tasted like childhood, like home, like everything the war had taken. She ate slowly, and when she finished, she looked at Dorothy Miller, this American farm wife who had lost her husband to Pearl Harbor, whose son was fighting against Greta's own country, and in careful, heavily accented English said, "Thank you. It is beautiful." The mess hall remained absolutely still. Dorothy smiled, eyes bright. "You're welcome." After that evening, something inside Greta began to shift, like ice breaking apart after a long winter. She did not suddenly become fluent in English. She did not abandon her caution, but she began to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing confidence. Simple phrases, practical words. Slowly, the language that had been her enemy became simply language. Corporal Stevens nearly dropped his coffee cup the first time she said "good morning" in the mess hall. He recovered quickly, smiled, replied in kind. The next day, she asked him about his farm, and he talked for 20 minutes about Iowa corn while she listened and occasionally asked a question. Dr. Cartwright noted the change in her next report. Subject has begun voluntary English communication. The catalyst appears to have been an act of unexpected kindness from a civilian, specifically, food prepared and shared with evident care. This suggests the subject's resistance was not to the language itself, but to what it represented: the enemy, the other, the force that destroyed her world. When an American proved capable of the same humanity she associated with her own people, the symbolic barrier dissolved. Dorothy Miller became a regular visitor to Camp Swift that winter. She brought vegetables from her garden, taught several of the women to make biscuits in the camp kitchen, and spent hours talking with Greta about ordinary things: recipes, weather, the stubbornness of chickens, the price of feed. Their conversations were a hybrid of English and German, with much gesturing and occasional laughter, when neither could find the right word. Greta learned that Dorothy's husband had been a Navy machinist, that her son wrote letters describing the French countryside, but never the fighting, that she kept chickens named after presidents, that she missed peach season most of all. In return, Greta spoke about Bremen's harbor at dawn, about her work in the telegraph office, about the night the bombs came and she'd helped pull survivors from rubble. She did not speak about politics or propaganda, or the things she'd been taught to believe about Americans. Those things felt distant now, irrelevant, belonging to a different version of herself. By December, Camp Swift had transformed in subtle ways. The German women organized a Christmas celebration in collaboration with the camp chaplain. They sang carols in German while American soldiers sat listening, some with tears in their eyes. Frau Richter taught the camp cooks to make Lebkuchen from a recipe she'd memorized. Liesel helped decorate the mess hall with paper snowflakes. Greta, at Dorothy's request, had sewn a quilt using fabric scraps from the repair shop, a pattern of interlocking stars in red, white, and blue. It was meant as a gift for Dorothy's son when he came home, if he came home. On Christmas Eve, Dorothy brought the pie again. This time there were 8 of them, enough for every woman in Barrack 7 to have a slice. They sat together in the warm mess hall, Americans and Germans, guards and prisoners, and shared something that transcended the categories that had divided them. One of the younger guards, barely 20, asked Greta in hesitant German about life in Bremen before the war. She told him about the fish markets, the ships, the seagulls that sounded different from Texas birds. He told her about Wisconsin, about ice fishing, about missing snow. Corporal Stevens played guitar, and several women sang, first in German, then in English, then in a mixture of both that made everyone laugh. At one point, Dorothy looked across the table at Greta and said, "I'm glad you spoke that day." Greta smiled, a real smile, tired but genuine. "I am also glad," she said. "The pie was very—" She searched for the word. "Persuasive." Dorothy laughed, and the sound filled the room like light. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the women of Camp Swift did not go home immediately. Repatriation took months: paperwork, transportation, verification of identities, arrangements with displaced persons camps in the occupation zones. Greta and the others waded through the Texas summer, working in the repair shop, learning more English, listening to radio reports about the devastation across Germany. Bremen had been particularly hard hit. The photos showed streets that no longer existed, buildings reduced to shells, the harbor choked with sunken ships. Dorothy visited less frequently as farm work intensified, but when she came, she brought news from outside, from the world that was slowly rebuilding itself. Her son had survived. He was in a hospital in France with shrapnel wounds but would recover. She cried when she told Greta, and Greta held her hand across the table, understanding without words. In August, Greta received notification. She would be on the first repatriation ship in September, returning to Bremen via Hamburg. She would leave Camp Swift on September 12th. The night before she left, the women of Barrack 7 held a farewell gathering. They had so little, no gifts to give except small things they'd made themselves. Liesel gave Greta a bookmark embroidered with Texas bluebonnets. Frau Richter gave her a recipe for American biscuits, written in careful German script. The others contributed hugs, tears, promises to write if they could. Dorothy came at dawn on the departure day. She brought one more pie and a package wrapped in brown paper. "For the ship," she said. "It's a long journey." Inside the package were practical things: a warm sweater, socks, a bar of soap, and a small leather-bound notebook. On the first page, Dorothy had written in careful German, "So you can write your story, so you can remember the good parts too." Greta's English had improved enough to read the inscription Dorothy had added in English below. "The best revenge against hate is living well, and remembering we are all just people trying to survive." They embraced at the gate, this American farm wife and this German telegraph operator, two women who should have been enemies but had instead become something else entirely. "Will you write?" Dorothy asked. "Yes," Greta promised in English. "I will write." Greta Hoffmann returned to Bremen in October 1945. The city she found was unrecognizable, 70% destroyed, streets impassable, survivors living in cellars and ruins. She found distant relatives who'd survived and began the slow work of rebuilding. She kept her promise. The letters between Greta and Dorothy continued for 37 years, written in increasingly confident English on Greta's side, in stubbornly enthusiastic German on Dorothy's. They wrote about ordinary things: gardens, weather, recipes, grandchildren eventually. They wrote about the extraordinary things too, the nightmares, the grief, the slow healing. In 1953, Greta married a schoolteacher named Werner Schultz and opened a small bakery in Bremen's rebuilding district. She specialized in both German and American pastries. The apple pie, she admitted in a letter, never quite matched Dorothy's, but she kept trying. Dorothy sent her the recipe in 1954, written out in meticulous detail. At the bottom, she'd added, "The secret ingredient is not cinnamon. It's making it for someone you care about." In 1972, when transatlantic flights became more affordable, Greta traveled to Texas. Dorothy, now 83, picked her up at the Austin airport in the same truck whose seat cover Greta had repaired 27 years earlier. They drove to Dorothy's farm, and Greta helped make apple pie in Dorothy's kitchen. Two old women, former enemies, laughing at each other's pronunciation and the stubbornness of pie crust. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in colors Greta remembered from her first evening at Camp Swift. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, and the air smelled of mesquite and approaching autumn. "I think about that day often," Greta said in English that had lost most of its accent. "When you brought the first pie, I was so certain I would never speak your language that it would mean surrender." Dorothy rocked slowly in her chair. "What changed your mind?" Greta considered this. "You showed me that language is not the enemy. Fear is the enemy. Hate is the enemy. But people." She gestured at the space between them. "People are just people, trying to survive, trying to show kindness when they can." "That's a long answer," Dorothy said with a smile. "The pie," Greta admitted. "The real answer is the pie." They laughed together as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. The same stars that had watched over Camp Swift, over Bremen, over all the places where the war had raged and ended and left its survivors to find their way back to being human. The story of Greta Hoffmann represents one of thousands of small transformations that occurred in the vast network of POW camps across America during World War II. The War Department's records show that by war's end, over 400,000 German prisoners had been held on American soil, from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to Virginia. Many returned home with stories similar to Greta's, of expectations shattered, propaganda dissolved, humanity discovered in unexpected places. These encounters did not erase the war's horrors or justify its causes, but they complicated the narrative in ways that mattered. The friendships formed between former enemies became part of the foundation for post-war reconciliation. The Marshall Plan's success in rebuilding Germany owed something to these human connections, these moments of recognition that enemy soldiers and civilians were also mothers, daughters, sisters trying to survive catastrophe. Camp Swift closed in 1946. Today, it's partly incorporated into Camp Swift Army National Guard training facility, partly returned to farmland. A small museum preserves some artifacts, photographs, uniforms, letters. Somewhere in its archives is a letter from Dorothy Miller to the camp commander, dated November 1945, requesting permission to maintain correspondence with a former prisoner. Permission was granted. The last letter Dorothy received from Greta arrived in April 1982, 2 weeks before Greta's death at age 73. It contained a recipe for Apfelkuchen, refined over decades, and a simple note. Thank you for teaching me English. Thank you for teaching me that enemies can become friends. Thank you for the pie that changed everything. Dorothy had it framed. It hung in her kitchen until her own death in 1989. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, small acts of kindness can dissolve the barriers we build between ourselves and others. Sometimes all it takes is apple pie and the courage to accept it.